Have you ever sat and stared up at the stars and wondered, where did we come from? Let's take a journey like no other, not to a place, but to a time. Join us as we delve deep into the human past and explore our shared human origins. Welcome to the world of paleoanthropology.
Hello, everybody. This is Seth from the world of paleoanthropology, and today for this episode of The Story of Us, I have a special guest, Dr. Emma Pomeroy. How are you today?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work? What's your main focus right now?
Okay, sure. Well, so I'm Dr. Emma Pomeroy. I am an assistant professor at the University of Cambridge. And one of the major things I'm working on at the moment is the new excavations at Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan as part of the Shanidar Cave project led by Professor Graham Barker at the University of Cambridge.
That is awesome. So, for anyone who knows anything about Neanderthals, this site should not sound new. It's a very famous Neanderthal site. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Shanidar Cave?
Sure, yeah. So as you just said, it is a really famous site, certainly amongst paleoanthropologists. It was first excavated between 1951 and 1960 by Ralph Selecki. And he and his team discovered the remains of 10 Neanderthals, and that included adults, but also young infants as well. And the site's become famous for various reasons. So one of them was the remains of the individual that became known as Shanidar 1. So this was a male who was around about 45,000 years ago. And he died relatively old age for Neanderthals, maybe sort of in his 40s, but he'd suffered a whole range of traumas during his life. And that includes a head injury, which perhaps left him blind. It seems he was paralyzed on one side, his right arm, and had probably lost the lower half of his right arm during life. So he also had arthritis, he had auditory exostosis, which is sort of the buildup of new bone formation in the ear canals, which then affects your hearing. He likely walked with a limp because of some of the other injuries that he had. And the evidence suggests that those injuries, certainly sort of the paralysis of that right arm, happened sort of at the end of kind of adolescence or perhaps early adulthood. So it indicates that actually he'd lived a very long time with these various challenges and various disabilities, if you like. So he's been quite a focus of attention because people have argued that this perhaps is evidence for Neanderthals' compassion and care for one another within the group. And then another famous Neanderthal from Shanidar Cave is, of course, Shanidar 4, which is sometimes known as the flower burial. And so Shanidar 4 is somewhat older, dating probably to around 75,000 years ago. And what was found with Shanidar 4, so they took lots of little soil samples around the bones and had that analysed by a palynologist, Arlette Leroy-Gorin, and she identified clusters of pollen in those samples, which she didn't find in other places in the cave. And so she and Selecki argued that perhaps this individual had been buried with flowers of various species and perhaps buried on a bed of flowers. And so again, this has been really central in debates about how Neanderthals conceptualized the world, but also dealt with death, and whether they sort of had, again, that capacity for compassion, but also a propensity for symbolism and symbolic thought like humans. And this is part of the reason why perhaps they buried their dead with these kind of funerary rituals. But of course, it's been extremely controversial in the intervening years.
Most definitely, and that is absolutely fascinating and shows us, I think, so many things about Neanderthals that make them so much more human than most people first believe. And I think now is a perfect time to just quickly mention that in a few months, I will be hosting another symposium on death and burials among hominins, and you, of course, will be joining us to talk about Neanderthals and their place in this world of, is this a deliberate burial? Is this not? What does this mean? So I think the fact that you bring this up right at the beginning is just shows how important this topic is,
Yeah.
because it's something that I think so many of us really wonder and need to know.
and
Um,
and it's been so hotly
yeah.
contested, I think, over the intervening years. And so, yeah, I'm really excited about the symposium that's coming up and the opportunity to talk about, you know, the evolution of mortuary behaviour and funerary behaviour
Mhm.
amongst hominins. So it's going to be really great.
It is. So you mentioned you're doing a new excavation, correct? So
Yes.
what's going on with that in Shanidar? What is this new excavation?
Yeah, so I didn't really mention what we'd found at all. I've talked so far about Seleki's work,
If
which is
you
obviously
can.
so interesting. Yeah, no, we absolutely can. So the new Shanidar Cave project, as I mentioned, is led by Professor Graham Barker of the University of Cambridge. And that began in 2014 with excavations in 2015 onwards. And that was at the invitation of the Department of Antiquities and the Kurdish Regional Government, and because they recognised the importance of the site. But actually, the purpose of the project was never to go finding Neanderthal remains. That wasn't it at all.
Mhm.
What they hoped to do was to use kind of the whole spectrum and diversity of kind of modern scientific techniques that we can now use as archaeologists and paleoanthropologists to enhance the work that Seleki had done. So the idea was to open up or reopen part of that big trench that Seleki dug in the middle of the cave, and do much smaller scale excavations around the edge, but in a high level of detail. So taking lots of samples of various things, including pollen analysis, but also applying new dating methods, and really trying to understand the nature of both Neanderthal and then subsequent modern human behaviour and use of the cave, and understand, for example, how the climate changed and perhaps how that was linked to the behaviour of Neanderthals and modern humans there. So as I said, the intention was never to find any more Neanderthal remains, but as chance would have it, they did. And so actually, when the project first started, I wasn't part of it, and I was actually asked to join once they'd found some new Neanderthal remains. And the first things that were found was part of the lower limbs of Shanidar 5, or what we were subsequently able to identify as Shanidar 5. Which was one of the individuals that Seleki's team had originally excavated, and they did say in their notes, you know, we think perhaps it was rushed at the end of the field season in 1960, and they said there may be some more remains of this individual there, and indeed there were. Then subsequently digging down further into Seleki's trench, into what's known as the deep sounding. So this is a part of the trench where he went all the way down to bedrock. In the section of that trench, as we were sort of clearing out the backfill and cleaning it up, we found a few Neanderthal hand bones. And so then, of course, everything kind of slows down, and we had to look for where those were coming from, and discovered in that section wall a clear kind of, I guess, sort of eye-shaped area in the wall where there was a concentration of hominin remains, and that included some hand bones, but also the clear outline of some ribs, and part of one humerus. So that was super exciting. But of course, as always, it happened near the end of that particular field season, and we are there where those remains are. So they turned out to be very close to where the Shanidar 4 remains were originally removed. So we're about 7.5 meters from the surface, which means that to actually excavate them in plan, it's quite a lot of work just to excavate down what's above them, even though the excavation had been stepped. And then there's also concerns of, because, you know, we're opening up an old trench and revealing old sections that were dug, you know, perhaps as early as 1951, but up to 1960. And because they have been exposed, there's always risk that they might be less stable, for example. Mm-hmm. So it's not a straightforward operation to then excavate down on top of them. But we did in subsequent seasons, and amazingly, we found basically the whole upper body of a Neanderthal individual. So a skull which was squashed almost entirely flat on its side. And below that, the left arm kind of tucked under the head, and then the whole of the rib cage. And it turned out that hand that we could see in the section was actually part of the right hand. So the only bit we're missing from the upper body is kind of the right elbow area. But the individual had been cut off at the waist, so we've got nothing from the waist downwards. And how they got cut off was because they were right next to where Selecki found Shanidar 4, the flower burial. And because that was in a poor state of preservation, they decided to remove Shanidar 4 en bloc. So remove a whole block of sediment supported by wooden boards and plaster and everything, so that they could excavate it in much more controlled conditions in the lab. So that's what they did, and they hadn't realized that underneath Shanidar 4 were other individuals. And they describe, as you know, as they were cutting out this block, there was a kind of trickle of extra bones, which kind of flagged to them that there might be more individuals in that block. So what we think is the case, and we've been able to identify this from archived pictures and published photos, that basically the lower limbs of Shanidar Z, as we've called this new individual for now, were probably in that block that Shanidar 4 was removed in.
So were the bones that were trickling out not saved somewhere, or you don't know, like no one knows where they are? Okay.
Yeah, no, they were, and I believe, or at least that's what my belief is, and I think they are now with the remains of the other Neanderthals, which are all apart from Shanidar 3 and Shanidar 10, they're all in the museum in Baghdad, the Iraq Museum.
Okay.
And so as it turned out, just sort of following on that story, when they came to excavate that block in the museum with Shanidar 4 in, it turned out that there were actually at least parts of 2 other adult Neanderthals, which became known as 6 and 8, and part of a Neanderthal baby, which became known as Shanidar 9. So my understanding is that all of those bones, including those loose ones, will be in the museum. And part of what we're hoping to do is to go back and re-examine those to see if we can get a bit more of an understanding of how the upper body of Shanidar Z relates to those individuals that are in the block.
Most definitely. That's just so fascinating that you literally are following this trail of literally just bones that are trickling out and trying to put together these individuals. So when I think of a crushed face, I think of Sahelanthropus chilensis. Now you're saying this face is completely flat, like it's just
flattened? So if you imagine the skull was lying on its side, and then it is completely flat, so I guess the whole skull is maybe 3 centimeters thick.
Wow.
And so that's kind of interesting in itself, because what that indicates is that it must have been there long enough for the brain to decompose and the soft tissues to decompose, but not long enough for that void within the skull to be filled with sediment, and that actually it had been kind of crushed and collapsed fairly early on in its history, if you like. But yeah, it has made quite a challenge, if you like, in terms of reconstruction, recovery, conservation. And actually, we have a fantastic conservator working with us on the project at the moment, Lucia Lopez Paulin, who's taken on that tricky task of cleaning everything up and reconstructing the skull, and she's doing some really fantastic work. So yeah, it's ongoing, but very exciting stuff.
Amazing. That's just, I just love hearing about new work that's going on and new things that people are doing. And so what implications do you think this new find will have on Shanidar in general and Neanderthals in general? Does it change the narrative at all? Does it add to it?
Yes, potentially. I'm not sure we are in a position just yet to fully understand the implications of the find, because the work is ongoing. And we are still excavating at Shanidar as well, and we've been excavating more around that area too. But as the conservation work progresses, we're also learning more, and of course we'll be applying all sorts of other techniques as well to try and understand more about this individual. One of the really interesting things I think we have been able to show is using sediment micromorphology or soil micromorphology, which is where you basically take a little block of the sediment out intact, you embed it in a resin, and then you take really thin slices that you can then look at under the microscope and look at the kind of microstructure of the sediment. And we took one of these blocks across sort of the bottom of where the bones were, and then the sediments lying just underneath it. And that's been able to show us, you know, quite strong evidence that the body of Shanidar Z was put into what was likely a natural depression from sort of running water in the middle of the cave, but that was also dug out. So basically, they'd found sort of a natural depression and dug it out a bit further to make it a bit deeper. And we can see that because of, for example, how the sediment underneath the bones is compressed. And if you imagine you're digging a hole, as you dig, you're putting pressure on the sediment underneath, just like right underneath what you're taking out, right? And we can see that in the sediment, and we can also see a clear difference between what's around the bones and what's in this layer underneath. So that is certainly strong evidence, I think, that this is an intentional deposition of these remains. I also think it's very interesting that we've got this cluster, and people talk a lot with Shanidar 4 about the flower barrel, you know, that's what it's famous for. But actually, for me, it's really remarkable if you think about it. Selecki and his team took out a block that was maybe 1 meter by 1 meter by 0.5 meter with Shanidar 4's skeleton in. And that also included the remains of 3 other individuals. So you've got at least 4 individuals in 1 meter by 1 meter by 50 centimeters, which is quite remarkable. And now we can add the Shanidar Z remains to that group as well. And in fact, it might be part of one of those same individuals that was already recovered before. But that's very interesting. You've got a huge cave at Shanidar. And so why do we have this concentration of individuals in this one spot? And that could indicate, one of the ideas we're sort of, or one of the theories we're trying to work out whether we can test, is that this was intentional, that they're going back to this very same spot in the cave to bury individuals. Now, is that coincidence? I kind of think the concentration is too much to be coincidence, but it's one possibility we have to entertain. We also have to think about some of the features of the cave in that very spot. And actually, there's a big vertical slab of stone. There are other stones that were recorded there, and perhaps another stone that was perhaps behind the skull, which may potentially have been placed intentionally behind the head of the individual, because it just doesn't fit. You know, we have layers of rockfall throughout the cave because there's a big fault in the ceiling and rock falls down, but this isn't part of one of those layers. It's just kind of a random rock. So we're wondering if perhaps this big vertical slab right next to them could perhaps have acted as a marker. So as I said, these are all things that we're still investigating and still working on. But ultimately, I think this is a really exciting opportunity to actually investigate one of the, you know, burials, I think probably we can call it that, at such an iconic site as Shanidar Cave, with all of the power and the amazing, you know, insights that we can get from modern archaeological science, which at Selecki's time just wasn't even, you know, a dream for Mo at the time, right? And so we can test some of these ideas, and I think a lot of interpretation of Neanderthal mortuary or funerary behavior relies quite often on kind of going back to older excavations and trying to read into the notes from older excavations, just because these kind of finds are not that common, right? And that can be problematic because standards of excavation were different in the past, which is natural. It's not a criticism. It's just, the field moves on and our understanding moves on, right? Also, the detail in the records might not be sufficient. So here we have an in situ example where we have the opportunity to use all the techniques we can to try and answer as many of those questions about, is this intentional burial? Is it burial as such, or is the body perhaps being covered with something else? Can we see evidence of plant remains, which it seems like there might be around the bones? But if so, how are they getting there? Can we investigate other mechanisms other than this necessarily being placed there? And so I think ultimately this will shed some really important new light on Neanderthal mortuary or funerary behavior. So that distinction, perhaps, mortuary suggests doing something with the dead body, whereas funerary implies that there is a symbolic aspect of that. And I think by shedding light on that sort of mortuary stroke funerary behavior at Shanidar, that tells us something about the Neanderthals there, but also has wider implications for our understanding of Neanderthal behavior more widely. So, and then some of the other analyses, we're hoping we might be able to do ancient DNA analyses and things like this. It's perhaps a bit of a long shot because, we're quite a way south, and it's not the best climate for ancient DNA preservation.
Right.
There's huge potential there if we are lucky to gain some novel insights again into sort of Neanderthal demographics and variation. We have no DNA from these sort of really southern Neanderthals at the moment. So yeah, it's, as I said, a lot of work in progress, so no concrete answers now, but I really do think that Shanidar, the current Shanidar work, has a lot of potential to really help sort of shape and move forward some of our ideas about Neanderthals, but also about the evolution of certain behaviour, such as mortuary and funerary behaviour and treatment of the dead. So,
and I think it's a topic that is just, it needs a lot of investment, and I think the work that you're doing and some others is really shedding some light on why we do what we do today, and why, for a time I worked at a funeral home actually, and
interesting.
Seeing the different demographics of people and the way that they honored their lost relative was very interesting. And to think, how did all of these different ways of mourning the dead sprout from what? And I think it's fascinating.
Absolutely.
Now,
yeah, sorry.
What do we know about the paleo environment at the time? Because we say there's flowers there, but would flowers have been easy to get? Would they have been hard to get?
Yeah, no, they would have been. So, our understanding and colleagues on the project are doing some really amazing work looking at the paleoclimate. We've got Emily Tilby, who's been working on the microfauna and just completing her PhD and giving some really exciting insights there. And also Evan Hill working on some of the shells and the snails, which is another really important climatic indicator. And what it's showing is that Neanderthals are at Shanidar during periods when the climate's relatively mild, so probably not actually a lot different from the climate today. And so the climate today is that it can be quite cold in winter, so there is snow near the cave. In the spring, it's very pleasant, and it's an amazing place, and that's where most of the flowers are out. And it really is that cliche, but a sight to behold. It's incredible. Summers are very hot, and things become very dry. So a lot of things, a lot of the plants by this time of year are dying off. And so, yes, there would have been flowers readily available in the landscape right outside the cave. One of the clusters of pollen that I'll let Leroy Gohan identified was from hollyhock. And indeed, there's hollyhocks today literally growing out of the side of the cave, out of the rock, you know? So they were right there on their doorstep, to use kind of a phrase which is kind of inappropriate, I guess. But yes, those flowers around. I mean, there are questions about whether they'd have been in flower at the same time. And there are, you know, over the years, people have produced other hypotheses as to how the pollen might have got there to do with contamination. So again, that's something one of our colleagues and one of the co-directors of the project, Professor Chris Hunt at Liverpool John Moores University, has been doing some work on to really kind of try and drill down into, okay, what are these different hypotheses, and can we distinguish them, and what can we ultimately say about, yeah, how plants are being used. So.
And one thing I think I should have asked earlier was, what's the date range that we're dealing with with the Neanderthals?
Yeah, so specifically at Shanidar Cave, we're dealing with from about sort of 75,000 years ago, up to about 50,000 years ago. We do, or Seleki's excavations, and we haven't quite got down much further than where we are now, but we are finding evidence of stone tools going down somewhat later. But certainly the Neanderthal remains mainly in two clusters. One is around 75,000 years ago, one around 45,000 years ago. Of course, at Seleki's time, they had radiocarbon dating, but that was all. And radiocarbon is limited to about 45,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago at a push, as you may know. So many of the kind of deeper layers, Seleki had to make his best estimate as to how old they would be based on kind of climatic information and things like that. And so one of the things that we hope to do is, as we get down further, is to do some more dating now that we have techniques like OSL, and really understand, you know, how far back we can push those dates for hominin use of the cave. But yeah, certainly the actual Neanderthal remains themselves are 75 and around 45,000 years ago.
So, as you said, there's two clusters. There's not individuals going intermediately in between. So as in, it doesn't seem like there was continuous use of the cave that entire time.
Yeah, and so I mean, I guess I should clarify by clusters in that sense. I meant temporal clusters. So yeah, there's a time around 75,000 years ago where we have that physical cluster that is Shanidar 4, 6, 8, 9, and Z. But we also have, from about the same time, Shanidar 2, and who is an adult, and Shanidar 7, who was a baby. Then yes, we don't find Neanderthal remains again until about 45,000 years ago, and that's where we have Shanidar 1, Shanidar 3, and Shanidar 5.
Wow. Okay. So that's, to me, that's very significant that they somehow knew it was already had been used as a possible burial site.
Maybe they did. I mean, this is a really tricky question, right? And
right.
Because actually maybe they didn't, and maybe it was, you know, in the same way it was for the Neanderthals who were there around 75,000 years ago, around 45,000 years ago, Neanderthals again saw it's a suitable place to bury, just as, so for example, there are some sort of early what's been called proto-Neolithic burials in Shanidar Cave as well. So obviously of modern humans dating to about 10,000 or 11,000 years ago. And again, perhaps for them, for some reason, it was what they saw as a good place to bury their dead.
Right.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that they knew all those Neanderthals were down there, or the same thing. And even on a smaller time scale, we run into that problem. So if you think again about that cluster that I mentioned of Shanidar 4, 6, 8, 9, and Z, one of the questions we have is, well, were they all deposited at the same time? Or can we say that actually they were deposited at different times? And that those different times could be a year, it could be a decade, it could be a century, it could be thousands of years. And with the resolution of dating we have right now, it's quite hard to pinpoint them so precisely, especially as a number of those individuals were excavated, you know, back in 1960. But equally, that has implications for how we interpret it, right? So if they're all buried at the same time, that's one thing. If people are or Neanderthals are genuinely coming back to that one same spot in the cave and repeatedly using that same spot, it seems a bit too much for coincidence. And we do have some evidence actually from so we have the remains of Shanidar Z and then a small kind of, say, 10 centimeter layer of sediment or layers of sediment, and below that more Neanderthal remains, which does suggest that there's a temporal gap. Hard to say how big it is right now. So it does seem they might be coming right back to that very same spot. But yeah, again, we come to that same problem. You know, did they know, or was that big vertical bit of rock that an individual was buried behind at one point, however long later, more Neanderthals come along and think, oh, you know what, that sheltered place behind that big vertical rock, that's a good place to tuck away a body? Or, you know, it's very hard to tease apart these possibilities, but I think we have to try, because if we can, it tells us something very interesting about the behavior of Neanderthals. And we know a lot about them, and yet we know so little about them as well. So
I think that goes for most of anthropology, honestly, but I think that's also what makes anthropologists and other scientists so eager, is the unknown, is what is over the next horizon and what are we going to find out next. I think that's what drives a lot of people. So
I think so, and I think quite often in research we have these big questions, and maybe we're not going to be able to answer them in full, but every step we get to a little bit closer, every time we have a little bit more evidence, we get nearer and nearer to having a more thorough understanding of things like, you know, the origins of human behavior or whatever it might be. And I think that is one of the things that, you know, drives many of us. It's exciting, and there's always more questions and more unknown and more gaps to fill in. So
that's just, yeah, it just drives so many people forward. And speaking of driving people forward, there is a large group of individuals, myself included, who are joining the field and want to know things like, how do you end up on a team that is working at such an amazing site? How did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I have to say, I feel I've been very, very fortunate to have been asked to join the Shanidar Cave project. And I am very grateful to the whole team for giving me that opportunity and sort of bringing me on board, because it is amazing. You know, I'm sure you can relate to, I remember being an undergrad and learning about Shanidar and Neanderthals and writing an essay on, you know, did Neanderthals bury their dead? And never for a moment did I imagine that I would ever even see Shanidar Cave, let alone be excavating new Neanderthals there. So I am extraordinarily lucky. And I think part of, you know, how your career pans out, there is an element of luck, and that's a good thing in a way, but also I think maybe when you're sort of joining the field, as you say, that can feel a bit dispiriting, because then you're kind of like, well, you know, I could do all the work there is and still never get to do X or Y. And I think you have to keep the faith that, you know, there will be opportunities, and to take those opportunities that are offered to you. And I've been very fortunate that I've been offered a whole range of opportunities. And sometimes that just comes from talking to people, after I finished my undergrad, I'd got some funding to go out and work on a project in South America. And I was chatting to one person about the fact that I was doing that. And I said, oh, a friend of mine runs another project in Brazil. Why don't you go join them? And then it kind of snowballed. And through those opportunities, I was able to get experience of excavating human remains, analysing human remains, seeing what field projects were like. So I think taking your opportunities is really important. You also do need to study hard and get the grades and things like that. It does make a difference in terms of being able to secure funding and things like that. And so I studied archaeology and anthropology as an undergraduate, actually here in Cambridge. And to be honest, I came thinking I'd be an archaeologist, and I'd never heard of biological anthropology before, or paleoanthropology. And I discovered it when I got here, and it kind of blew my mind, the whole, what we knew then about human evolution. I was like, wow, this is a whole world that I've just never contemplated. And so I really got drawn in. But that interest in archaeology and in human osteology, which I think, I've been interested in skeletons since I was a kid, and it was just something, one of these weird things which you can't explain where it comes from. So I did my undergrad, and yeah, like I said, took those opportunities after my undergrad. To be honest, I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do as a career. And so I had a couple of years of working in various jobs. And then I came back and I thought, you know what, I really do love osteology, and I would love to do some more training. Even if it goes nowhere in terms of career, I'd love to do some more training. So I did a master's at Southampton in osteoarchaeology, and that was human remains and zooarchaeology as well, and loved it, but again was unsure. Spent some time in medical research because an opportunity came up there, and then again, I guess it was that call of osteology and paleoanthropology that I came back to do a PhD. And I have to say I was fortunate to be able to secure funding for those studies as well, because unfortunately postgraduate study and undergraduate study are expensive. And again, that's where doing as well as you can at each stage really helps, because it was kind of off the back of my undergrad results that I was able to secure funding for my master's, and then and so on. So I was really lucky to be able to get that funding, and did my PhD looking at adaptation to high altitude in the Andes, and skeletal variation there, and actually child growth, and sort of moved into a whole other area there as well, but all the time maintaining this interest in skeletal variation, in excavation, and the actual field work. And I think that was one of the reasons I was asked if I'd join the Shanidar project, was because they knew that I did have, I could excavate human remains or fossils, but I could also kind of do the analysis. So I think having those a range of skills can also be beneficial, because especially with a field project, for example, when you get out to the field, quite often it's a case of everyone mucks in, right? So we all have our specialities, and if human remains are found, then I'll go and be more involved. But in other times when there's perhaps not human remains, I'll be there helping with the wet sieving or the sorting, or filling out paperwork, doing whatever's needed. And I think so then having a range of skills and a range of experience can be beneficial too. But no, I am aware that I've also been really lucky, and the people who've supervised me, the people who've given me opportunities, yeah, and I hope that's something I can do for others in the future. That's one of probably my biggest ambition, is to kind of repay in that way. So
I think that is a great goal that you have, and I know once you reach it, you'll probably feel quite exuberated. So when going back, obviously, to Neanderthals, actually, really quickly, I want to ask you, since you mentioned it, last semester I took a class on Andean cultures and society. starting from Neolithic times. So I'm wondering, now that you brought it up, what biological variation they did have at high altitudes living in the Andes. Besides, I mean, I assume they had, you know, better levels of O2 respiration and things like that, but
Yeah,
what's different?
and I mean, we presume
Unrelated to
so. So
paleo, but yeah.
from looking at modern populations, you know, we assume that there are those physiological differences, and that they would have had those in the past as well. And really, some of those, you know, genetic adaptations that we see in contemporary Andean populations at high altitude are just starting to be investigated in past populations too. One of the things that really interested me about high altitude was that it's a multi-stress environment, right? Yes, you've got the hypoxia, so the low partial pressure of oxygen and the implications that has for physiology, but actually it's a tough place to live. It's tough terrain. The productivity of the land is different from at sea level and varies at different altitudinal levels. And so I was really interested. There's this whole model of sort of the vertical archipelago, which is this idea that actually you get all zonal complementarity, so different zones all the way from the coast right up to the highest mountains and the Puna have different affordances, so you can grow different things there, you can produce different things there, and so one idea is that Andean peoples, for, you know, as long as they've lived there, have exchanged and interacted or moved physically between different regions to take advantage of those resources. So from that point of view, I was kind of interested to see, okay, do we see what we see today? Because yes, often at high altitude populations tend to be shorter, but a lot of that height difference, for example, is attributed to socioeconomic conditions rather than necessarily altitude itself. And so while we do see, and I mean, this is not my work, this is work by Karen Weinstein, where we do see evidence of sort of different shape in the rib cage, for example, at high altitude, in skeletal populations from the Andes. I looked at things like body size and limb proportions, and one of the really remarkable things was actually that there wasn't a huge difference either through time or that related to altitude, for example. And that was kind of puzzling but interesting, because maybe that speaks to the effectiveness of some of these adaptive strategies. How also perhaps some of what's going on in the Andes is not necessarily in line with our assumptions about sort of the impacts of the transition to agriculture, for example. So you have these incredible groups who I'm sure you've heard of, the Chinchorro on kind of the North Chilean coast today, and they're hunter-gatherers. And in many parts of the world, we see stature decrease once people adopt agriculture, but we don't see that. We actually see the Chinchorro stature is very similar to later agricultural populations in that region. And so again, others have done some very interesting work on why that might be the case and what makes, you know, that situation different in terms of the environment. So no, absolutely fascinating area to work, fascinating and wonderful people and cultures. Like, you know, it's definitely my ambition to work back in the Andes someday.
Yes, that class was challenging, but I learned so much about all of the different cultures in the Andes, and it truly is a unique place. I mean, all places are unique, but it's a very special place.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So turning back a few, you know, tens of thousands of years, when we're talking about Neanderthal deposition of the dead, and mortuary and possible funerary rites, what do you think is going to come up next? Do you think we're going to find that key piece of evidence that's going to say, yes, they intentionally with ritual buried their dead? Do you think there's going to be a piece of evidence that everyone's just going to accept? Or do you think it's going to be controversial for decades to come?
That's a really tough question. I think it will always be controversial. It's interesting because in some ways we apply a bit of a double standard. And again, there are papers sort of going back to the 90s that make this argument that some of the things that we see in Neanderthal, sort of when we find Neanderthal remains, if we saw them in modern humans, we would have no problem interpreting that as an intentional burial with ritual and all this kind of thing. And yet we have this reluctance to say the same about Neanderthals. And it's a difficult one. So I think there will always be controversy, but I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing. But we should question the evidence and perhaps question our own assumptions. And I think that's what's really important when we're trying to study sort of Neanderthal funerary behavior and mortuary behavior, is that we are open to various possibilities and we try and be as objective as we can be. And with everything, look at various lines of evidence and say, okay, is there another explanation? What's the most likely explanation here? Perhaps if we were to find individuals with grave goods, I mean, that's often a very clear indication of some kind of symbolism, right? Then that might be particularly compelling. But again, the fact that we don't tend to find really clear grave goods. I mean, there have been some arguments for various Neanderthal burials that there may be grave goods, but actually, we get a lot of human societies that may bury their dead, but don't necessarily put anything with the body, or certainly not anything that would preserve.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's always going to be controversial, whatever. But that's one of the good things about science and about our field, is the debate and the rigor with which we test ideas. And I think that it is much more recognized now that actually we often used to talk about did Neanderthals bury their dead or not, and the debates moved way away from that and recognized the simplicity of that. So there's different reasons why you may bury your dead. Not all modern human societies bury their dead. Neanderthals do different things with their dead in different places. So we have sort of commingled remains and evidence of cannibalism and things like that. And indeed, that's probably what we should expect, right? We've got a species that's spread over a huge geographical area that's around for tens, hundreds of thousands of years, and who we know have large brains and are likely therefore to be capable of pretty complex behavior. So to assume that we'd not see that kind of variation is perhaps really short-sighted. So yeah, I don't know. It's a bit of a vague answer. I don't know. I'm not sure there will ever be any evidence that nobody questions. But I'm excited to see what does come out, because all of these debates and all of the findings and all of the discussion takes us a little bit further every time. Yeah, and I'm excited to see what comes out of our own work. It really is work in progress, and as we think more about these possibilities of there being sort of multiple individuals buried in one place or returning to a particular place in the landscape, I'm really excited to look at what evidence we have and how we might be able to test some of these ideas. But yeah, that's all to come. So
that sounds just so exciting, and I can't wait as well to see what comes out. And I think this is a perfect place to wrap up this wonderful chat that we've had about careers, Neanderthals, even the Andes. Is there anything you would like to add before we close up?
I don't think so, other than just to say thanks very much for this opportunity to chat. It's always great and exciting to talk about Shanidar and the work we're doing, but also the previous work about Neanderthals more generally. And yeah, no, it's been great to chat. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Of course, it's been wonderful to have you on. Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching this episode of The Story of Us. I hope you had an amazing time and learning experience. My guests and I had a great time putting this together for your enjoyment. I hope that you learned something and that there's always more to learn. If you would like to watch our previous episodes, please view them on my YouTube channel or my website, which is listed in the description below. And please subscribe and like to not miss future episodes. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.